Good morning. Good morning here at the Global Azure Austria at our first session here. My name is Rainer Stropek, and with me is my colleague Simon.
Hello, everyone.
In the next 50 minutes or so, we are going to talk to you, with you, about Web API security with Azure Active Directory. So, what can you expect from the upcoming 50 minutes? We will quickly do a short recap about the OpenID and OAuth protocol, just to make sure that everybody is on the same page. We will quickly discuss the most important topics and the most important terminology, so that we know what we are looking at, and then the majority of the session will be a live demo. So what we are going to do is we are going to register a client app, which is represented in our case by an Angular application, and we are going to register an API app. An API app, a RESTful web API, which we want to protect using Azure Active Directory. We are going to take a look at both registrations in the portal interactively, and we have also prepared some infrastructure as code scripts with the Azure CLI, and we are going to show you how you can automate the creation of app registration, service principals, and so on. And finally, of course, we are diving a little bit into Angular and ASP.NET Core 5 and show you how you can use the Microsoft Identity Foundation to add the necessary middlewares and token acquisition services to Angular and things like that. So that is approximately what we are going to do. And with that, I think we should dive right in. One last comment. Please use the YouTube comments if you have any questions. So I have the monitor here on the right-hand side, and I see your questions. So whenever we describe something which is not perfectly clear to you, send us a question, and we will try to answer the questions immediately. There is a short lag of approximately 15 seconds between your question and us seeing it, something like this. So yeah, keep that in mind, please. Okay. Let us quickly introduce ourselves. Simon and I, we are from the company Software Architects, and we help small, medium, and large companies to be successful in the cloud. We run our own software as a service solutions for many years now. We have been in Azure for more than 10 years. So all the things that we are going to show you today, we use that on a daily basis. Yeah. And with that, without any further ado, let's jump right into the topic, and let's, as promised, quickly repeat the most important concepts and terminology of OpenID and OAuth, because these are the protocols that we are going to talk about in the rest of this session. First, when we talk about OpenID and OAuth, a very important concept is the concept of the resource owner. The resource owner, that's essentially you, as the user. You own a certain resource. Think of, I don't know, your calendar in the cloud, maybe your Facebook timeline, whatever. You own a certain piece of data in the cloud, and you are the resource owner. So the resource owner is typically a person. In our context, it's a person. Then we have the client. And the name client is a little bit misleading here, because many people think that client means client in the sense of, I don't know, browser client, mobile client, something like this. But client can also mean server. It's just the client app. If you use a server-based technology like, I don't know, Node.js with Express or ASP.NET Core server-side HTML generation, MVC, something like this, then the client is really running on the server. So don't misunderstand that. Client does not mean that it has to run on a client. However, in our context, in our demo that we will show you today, client here means single page app client. That's a very common scenario nowadays. Many people write single page app clients using React or Angular or any other technology. And this is what we are going to show you. So client in our context means client, but in general, it can also mean client software running on a server. Then we have the protected resource. That is the API that our client would like to access. And here comes in a very important concept. OAuth and OpenID is considered to be a trust delegation protocol. That means it is a protocol with which a resource owner can delegate the permission to a client app to interact with a protected resource on her behalf. So I, as a user, say, okay, this Angular app is allowed to go to an API and do like it is me. So it's going to this API and says, Rainer gave me the permission to interact with you. So this is a very important concept here. The protected resource is the API that the client wants to access in the name of the resource owner. And last but not least, we have the authorization server, and the authorization server is in our case, Azure Active Directory. It's the server implementing the OpenID or OAuth protocol, doing the heavy lifting when it comes to authentication, is the user who he claims to be, and gathering the claims. Claims are claims about the user, things like a user identifier, the first name, the last name, group memberships, things like that. This is the task of the authorization server, to gather these claims and to put them into a so-called token.
Just to quickly add,
yes,
it's
please.
often also referred to as the authority and the token issuer. So that's also something you might see in literature.
Yeah, we will see that throughout the entire session. It is a little bit of a chaos in terms of terminology, because when we take also a look at Azure Active Directory, sometimes a thing is called the client ID, then it's called the application ID, then it's called the client application ID, and everything means the same. And the same is true here for the auth server. Thank you for pointing that out. So terminology is sometimes a little bit misleading, but we hope to sort that out. Now, how does the flow work like? We are talking about flows in OpenID. First, the resource owner uses the client. So in our case, the resource owner starts a browser and runs, in our case, Angular, the Angular client. Now, this client would like to offer a login button, and the login button will give the control back to the resource owner, and the client will be out of the picture for a second. So the client app is no longer in control, but the resource owner is using the browser and is redirected through the browser to the authorization server. Now, on the authorization server, this little dance happens where you enter a username and a password and maybe some multi-factor authentication, maybe some biometry or things like that. And at one point in this flow, the authorization server has enough information and enough proof to be sure that the resource owner is who she claims to be. And then the authorization server can generate a token and redirect back to the client app and give this token to the client. However, this process of generating the token and giving back the token to the client is a more elaborate process that than the one that I'm showing here now, because we have a two-step process here. The authorization server first gives a code, a one-time code to the client. And the client then uses a second request to the token issuer, to the authorization server, to switch the code for a token. And in this context, there comes in a rather modern technology, a modern flavor of the flow, which is called the PKCE or PIXE flow, and we will dive into more details when we do the demo here. So bear with me for now. Just remember, somehow, magically, Harry Potter programming, a little bit of fairy dust, the authorization server issues a token, and the token gets to the client. The details about this token issuing will be topic in a few minutes. And then
some of you might thinking, I've seen that before and it wasn't so complicated then. That's because in the past there have been flows that were used that directly issued the token and prevented the complexity of having that, but those are no longer recommended. So if you're building something new, you should be wary to choose the correct flows now.
I think, Simon, you are referring to things like the implicit flow and things like that, right?
Implicit, hybrid, yeah.
Yeah, so keep that in mind. If you are building web apps and you are still using implicit flow and things like that, be prepared for some changes. You should really think about migrating to more modern protocols, more modern flavors of OAuth and OpenID. Now, when the client has the token, but, oops, sorry, wrong direction here. When the client has the token can be used to access the API. So the token is delivered to the protected resource, which is the API, and the API can verify the token. How does the API verify the token? It verifies the token by verifying a digital signature. So in our case, Azure Active Directory is publishing public keys. And with these public keys, the protected resource can fetch these public keys and can use the public keys to verify that the token really came from Azure Active Directory. There are some additional thoughts here. This token is really specific to a certain protected resource. So the client will have multiple tokens for the different APIs that the client talks to. It's like a visa when you travel to a country. A token is like a visa for a country. Imagine you would like to travel to Russia. You need a visa for Russia to get into Russia. And if you travel to China, you need a visa for China. You cannot take the visa for China to enter Russia. That doesn't work. That's the so-called audience, and the audience is encoded in the token. So the client has to have a mechanism to get different tokens for different protected resources, and you will see that in more details when we dive into the protocol flow in the example section a little bit later in the demo. To keep it simple, we have a token, we present the token, we get into the protected resource and can do whatever the token allows us to do. Now, one thing I didn't mention yet, but I think we should cover it at this point, the so-called consent. I often see that people struggle with understanding the concept. I'm quite sure you know this concept thing, consent thing. When you log in, for instance, to your Google auth, to your Google identity or Microsoft account or Azure Active Directory, you sometimes get presented with a screen that says, hey, this application would like to do this and that on your behalf. Are you okay with that? This is something that the authorization server is responsible to do. It is important that the authorization server makes it very clear to the resource owner that the resource owner is now saying okay to the fact that the authorization server will create a token that empowers the client to do certain things on his or her behalf. That is the consent. And this consent is for humans, for us humans. It should make it very clear for us what we are now agreeing to. And this is what the authorization server does. And this consent also is connected to the concept of scopes, because a client can say, I would like to access a protected resource, the API, but it doesn't need to say I need everything from that protected resource. Imagine a calendar. A scope could be calendar read. So a client could say, I only need to read data from this API. And then it tells the authorization server that it only needs the read scope. And then the consent screen will tell the user, hey user, don't worry, relax. This will be a token that can only read data from the calendar. And then when the client sends the token to the protected resource knows that the resource owner only agreed that the client reads data from her calendar. Another scope would be write calendar. That would mean that the resource owner agreed that the client is allowed to write into the calendar. That is the concept of scopes. And of course, the API, the protected resource, has to make sure that it validates that the correct scopes have been agreed to by the resource owner in the consent process. We will see that live later on in the demo. In our case, as I mentioned, the authorization server will be Azure Active Directory, and the protected resource will be a custom API. This will be the main part of the demo. Now we have an important concept here when we talk about Azure Active Directory, and that will be the last slide, and then we dive right into the demos. This slide shows you that it is possible that in Azure Active Directory, you create so-called single-tenant apps and multi-tenant apps. If we go back here, this is a typical setting of a so-called single-tenant app. So a company who owns a certain Azure Active Directory creates a protected resource, a custom API, for internal purposes. So it owns the Azure Active Directory tenant, it owns the API, and only resource owners belonging or being guests of the Azure Active Directory are allowed to access the protected resource. But in this case here, this demo shows a different kind of authorization topology. Because of time constraints, we will not demo that, but we have definitely to talk about it. And this is called the so-called multi-tenant apps. So again, we have a resource owner and we have the client, and then we have a protected resource. But this protected resource is in the Azure Active Directory of a software as a service publisher. For instance, our company, we are offering a software as a service which is called Time Cockpit. We would be the publisher of an API. And this API is registered in our Azure Active Directory. But it might happen that there is a company called Acme. They have their own Azure Active Directory, and their users would also like to access our centrally deployed API. And this is what we call a multi-tenant app, a multi-tenant API. That means we have multiple Azure Active Directories, and the resource owner uses an account from her own Azure Active Directory, but accesses the Azure Active Directory, the API, which is registered in a different Azure Active Directory, in the Azure Active Directory of the software as a service provider. Now, what we have here, let me here unveil the arrows here. What we have here is two very important concepts. Oh, I forgot to start my zooming tool. Sorry, now it works. Here, up here, in the AAD of the publisher, we have two important concepts when it comes to AAD, and that's always, in my experience, a root cause for many problems when understanding AAD. We have a two-part registration in the Azure Active Directory. We have on the one hand side the app registration, which registers the API or the client, and additionally we have the so-called enterprise app. The enterprise app copies parts of the app registration and represents a small portion of the app registration inside the Azure Active Directory of the user. But here in a multi-tenant app, you see that in the Azure Active Directory of the users, this is the customer's Azure Active Directory, they only have what is called an enterprise app, also called a service principal. So when the first resource owner, the first user of the Acme Corp is signing in using this client, using this protected resource, parts of the app registration from the software as a service provider is copied into the Azure Active Directory of Acme Corp and represents the application inside of the AAD of the customer. And of course, we can have multiple of these customers, and this is why it's called a multi-tenant app. The first one was a single tenant app. So if you are a software as a service provider, you will probably have a setup like that. If you are a regular enterprise, an enterprise customer, and you are just building software for your own purposes, you will end up with a single tenant API registration, which looks like that. In the demo part, which will follow in a minute or so, you will only see this here because we only have 50 minutes and the multi-tenant setup is not that different from the basic principles. Simon, do you want to add anything? Did I forget anything?
I would just like to mention that when working with OpenID Connect and OAuth, consent might not be as much of a topic for pure enterprise environments where the vendor of the software solutions is basically the same as the authority issuing the tokens, because then you are in a complete environment where everything is published by the same entity, and then consent is less important.
Yeah, you can even pre-consent a client and an API so that the user doesn't get the consent screen. If an administrator registering the app says, hey, the user is an employee of our company, he has no choice than consenting because he needs to access the API and the app. Why bothering with a consent screen? So you can pre-consent a client or an API, and then the consent screen is dropped. But especially in situations where the client Here, this one is implemented by a certain company, and a protected resource is implemented by a different company. Think of an alternative email client which wants to access your Microsoft Graph API, display some calendar items. There it is super important to have the consent screen, because maybe you do not fully trust the client here, because it is maybe a client that you found on the internet, and you want to make sure that the client can only do what you are really allowing it to do. Okay?
Yeah, it might also be interesting to note that depending on your Azure Active Directory tenant settings, you might actually need an administrator for the first use of the application, or the user might just be able to do that. So there might be issues depending on your IT scenario.
Absolutely. That's always a big issue, a big thing when we build those applications and protect them with Azure Active Directory. Simon, what do you think? I think we should go into demo time, right? Enough theory. We want to see it. Show me the code. We will show you the code here. So let me get rid of this browser here, and I'm here in Visual Studio Code, and maybe I will turn off my camera so you will really see the code enlarged exactly like that. And here I have a little bit of an infrastructure as code script. So what I am going to do in this demo is not so much clicking around in the portal. We will click around in the portal, but only to view things. But we want to automate the creation of things. And this is a very important finding that we have learned in the last 10 years of using Azure. Infrastructure as code rules. Automate things. Get familiar with PowerShell or ARM templates or Bicep or Terraform or Azure CLI. Any kind of automation platform is key, because when you automate things in scripts, you can check it in, you can version control them, you can share them, you can do reviewing in your team so that you can benefit from the knowledge gathered by other teams and things like that. Infrastructure as code is key. The portal, the Azure portal, is useful, especially useful when you are not that familiar with Azure, when you are just learning. Then it's good to have a portal, because a GUI gives you a little bit of a guidance what you could do. The Azure portal is also very useful when you do troubleshooting, when you explore things, when you want to take a look at the configuration. But when you do serious production development, automate the deployment process, automate the creation of service principals, of app registrations, and all these things. It's super important. And if you take away anything from this session, then please take away this one, okay? Infrastructure as code rules. Now here, I have a demo environment, and currently, if we take a look at app registrations, we don't have any app registration here that starts with GAA, like Global Azure Austria. So I have an empty demo environment here. That's not a production Azure tenant, it's AAD tenant, it's just a sandbox environment. And the first thing that I am going to do is I'm calling this create AAD app registration, and I'm going to create a client app that will represent my Angular app using this statement, and I will show you the script in a second. Let me quickly run this thing. Hopefully it will work. We will see. Okay, it created an app, and now it is setting up the so-called single page app redirect URI. That will take a few seconds. We will wait for these few seconds, and I will tell you in a second why we see this failed messages here. I can describe it now. You see, when you create something in Azure Active Directory, for instance, you register an app, you have to be aware that the app is not immediately available. There is a small time gap. If you create or register an app, it is not immediately available. It takes something like 30 seconds or so until Azure Active Directory has really activated your changes. So sometimes people write scripts and they create an app registration and try to immediately do some changes in the app, configuration changes, and their scripts fail and they don't know why. They get strange errors that the app doesn't exist, although they created it a second ago. Well, keep that in mind. It takes a little bit. So in a script like that, it is a good idea to have a loop and retry the configuration if you have just registered the app a second ago. And after 30 seconds or so, everything will be fine and you will be good and can change the things that you would like to change. Now let's quickly take a look at this script and let's take a look what I do here. The most important statement that is useful for us here is this one, azad app create. By the way, this code is in GitHub and I already posted the link to GitHub in our Discord server. So if you would like to take a look at this bash script after the session, go into our Discord server or send me a direct message on Twitter or whatever. I can easily share the link to the GitHub repository with you because I will now only pick out some details here and I will not walk you through the entire code. Now this one creates an app registration with the given display name, and we are using available to other tenants false, which means we are creating a single tenant app. Okay, good. Now, this statement here should, if everything goes correctly, let's see if I already, yes, here it is. It created an app, as you can see it here. It is my organization only, as you can see it here. We got some important IDs here. These IDs are super important, and we have to talk about them a second. Here, this application client ID, that's the app ID. Azure uses the term application ID, and it means client ID in terms of OpenID Connect. So if you read application ID or if you read client ID, they are synonyms. You always have to use this GUID. Now this GUID here is the GUID of our Azure Active Directory tenant. It's not very exciting here. And this one is the object ID. And the object ID and application ID is always a reason for people struggling with AAD, because sometimes in PowerShell or Azure CLI or the REST API of Azure, sometimes you have to specify the object ID and sometimes you have to specify the application ID, and sometimes you can specify both and Azure will recognize whether it's an application ID or object ID. Essentially, yeah, there are these two GUIDs and you have to read the documentation carefully to not fall into this trap and specify the wrong ID here. Simon, I bet that you fall into this trap too, didn't you?
Yeah, we've seen that a lot in the last years, especially in PowerShell. It's often tempting to just use .id, the property on some object, and without thinking about it. So yeah, you have to have a closer look at the documentation of the commandlets you're actually using. Yeah, absolutely. And if you are not sure and the documentation isn't clear, try both. That would be my advice. Try the first one, and if you see strange errors, try the other one. That's my pragmatic approach. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. If we go to authentication here, we see that we have a redirect URI here. This redirect URI is the URI to which Azure Active Directory is allowed to send tokens. And the important thing here is that if we add a platform, if you would add it here interactively, you see that you have to distinguish between the different platforms here. There are different flows depending on which client platform you really use. So if you use a single page app, it's different from a web app with a server part. It's different from a mobile app. It's different from a desktop app. And for this demo, we are going to use single page apps. And the modern flow for single page apps is this one. Authorization code flow with Pixie. What does that mean? That means that we have a two-step process for issuing tokens to the single page app. That means the single page app doesn't receive the tokens immediately, but in the first step, after the user authenticated, the app receives a code. And it can take this code, send it to the so-called token endpoint, and switch the code, exchange the code against tokens. And this Pixie stuff makes sure that if somebody gets his hold on the code, cannot misuse the code, because there is an additional code verifier which the app sends to Azure Active Directory and has to resend when getting the token. It's not perfectly correct because one is the hash and one is the code, but we will not go that deep into the protocol. But that's kind of complicated. And to be honest,
You don't have to know the protocol details because you are going to use Microsoft Identity Platform, and it will handle the details for you. The important thing that you should take away from this session is that in modern single-page apps, you should definitely go for the authorization code flow with PKCI, with PKCI, and that is the modern way of doing authentication here. So that is the single-page app, and this was done by specifying you see it here by specifying the SPA redirect. And if you want to know how you can set in an infrastructure as code script, how you can set the single page app redirect, it is done like that. Unfortunately, there is no dedicated Azure CLI statement with which you could set single page app redirects. You have to use the Graph API of Microsoft. But luckily, the Azure CLI supports a really nice command, which is called AZREST, and it does a patch HTTP request to the Graph API and updates the single page app redirect. Of course, if you use the portal, it's just a click away, but as I told you, infrastructure as code rules. So now we already have app registration inside of our Azure Active Directory. But that is by far not enough, because currently we only have the application registration. What we don't have is the so-called service principal or enterprise app. The app registration is only, if I go back here, is only this part here, app registration. But if we want to use this app API, this client in our company, in our Azure Active Directory, we have to, in addition to that, do the enterprise application registration. Technically speaking, it is called creating a service principal. And that is the endpoint. That is the data item in Azure Active Directory, where Azure Active Directory can store, for instance, information like who consented to which scopes of the application. And that has to be a property of each tenant where the client is used. So the client is registered by the publisher, and in every Azure Active Directory where the client is used, there has to be this enterprise application here. If you register an application here interactively in the portal, if you do it here, the portal will automatically create the enterprise application registration for you. But if you do it in a script, you have to do that manually. And this is what I did here in this script. Let's run this guy here, and this will just recognize that the app already registered, but it will, in addition to that, register the service principal. So if we go here and scroll a little bit down, it will create the service principal by issuing the statement AZ-AD service principal create. And that registers the client inside of our Active Directory and makes it possible to be used in our Azure Active Directory. And again, this one in a multi-tenant app would be done in every AAD that uses the client. The thing that we had up here, this one, where is it? Here, this one would be done only once in the AAD of the publishing organization. Okay, nice. So if we go now here to enterprise application, and if I say all applications, and if I say GAA, let's see, here it is. Now we have the enterprise application registered in the portal. That looks good. That looks good. So next step. The next step is I would like later on to try Postman to interactively interact with our API. And for that, I have to run this statement here. Just bear with me. I will not go into the details. We will talk about the details later on, okay? It created an app secret. Here you see the app secret. I will quickly copy it in. Of course, you should never display that on a video if that is a production app, but this is just demo and I will delete it afterwards. So it's perfectly fine. So bear with me. I will tell you more about this one in a second. Now we have the client. Remember, we had here this one. What we now did is we registered the client, and now we need to register the protected resource, the API. Let's do that. The API is also registered as an app, but this time we are going to not only register the app, but we also create a so-called API identifier. Let's do that one, and then I will show you that in the Azure portal. So if we go into the Azure portal and we now take a look at the GAA, where is it? It takes a few more moments until the API will be available. I will refresh my browser and hopefully I will get it here in a second. Here it is, the API. Now this time when we do the API, we can here say expose an API. And if an app registration would like to expose an API, we need to define a so-called app ID. And this app ID could be a URI, something like https api.migratecompany.com, blah, or as in this case here, I'm just using a GUID because this is just a demo. This is a big difference. A client would not expose an API and would not have an application ID URI, but an API has something like this. And why do we have that? Because now we can define the so-called scopes. We can now say, and I have automated this guy here, we can now say which permissions our API supports. And for demo purposes, I created a read scope and a write scope. See that one? Okay, so let's add these scopes, and I also automated that one. Let's run that. You can take a look at the detailed Azure CLI statements. That's not in scope for this demo. We only have 50 minutes, so we have to get going. The important thing here is when you run this, and this essentially imports this JSON file, the following thing happens. If I refresh the screen here, it will take a few more moments until this changes here. I told you exactly at the beginning, when I started with AAD, this was the situation where I asked myself, hey, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? I became nervous, but in reality, now I know I have to be a little bit more chilled because in a few seconds, it will be here. And you see, here it is. So whatever you change in AAD, give it a second, grab a cup of coffee, come back, and everything will be fine. Now, you see here, we have the different scopes. And here you see which scopes the API can offer. And this drives the consent. So when the client accesses the API, the client can say, I need to write data or read data. And these scopes depend on what your API does. I cannot tell you which scopes make sense. Maybe you have a small API and then you have only one scope. Maybe you have a huge API and then you might end up with hundreds of scopes. I don't know. It really depends on your API. It's a kind of making it possible that the client can make a fine-grained decision which parts of the API the client wants to access from the protected resource. Think back to the calendar example. It is not enough to tell the resource owner, hey, I want to access your calendar. That would be too broad. Maybe the client only wants to read data from the calendar or only write data to the calendar, and that would be scopes, okay? And in this case, I created two scopes, read and write, just for demo purposes. And now you also know why this API ID URI is important here, because in Azure Active Directory, the scopes are identified by taking the application ID URI, appending the scope. So if the client says, I would like to access this API and do write, then it has to use this scope here, this whole scope, to tell Azure Active Directory exactly that. Okay, sounds good. So now we have the scopes. We are good. Last but not least, we need to give our client permissions to access the app. So what we do last here, and then we spend the final 10 minutes that we have doing a little bit of Angular and C#. Now we have to specify that this client is allowed to access this protected resource. And we have to tell Azure Active Directory about that. And we do that with two important statements. We do that with Azure AD permission add. Here we can tell that the client, this client, is allowed to access a certain API, for instance, this API, with these scopes here. And afterwards, once we added all the permissions, we have to activate them by calling Azure AD app permission grant. So it's not enough to call Azure AD app permission add, you have to grant them to. You can issue multiple of these permission add statements, and at the end you can activate everything in one go with Azure AD app permission grant. So I have to here edit some GUIDs. Give me a second. I have to do that here. Go here and GAA. Here it is. Let's start with the client app. I have to copy the API here. I could have automated that too, but I didn't find the time, to be honest. And here is the API. I will take this API here. This is the API. Good. And with that, we can run all this stuff here. That will give our client the permission to access APIs. For those of you who watch closely, you will see that I'm not just giving permissions to access our API, but I'm also giving permissions, here you can see that, to access the Microsoft Graph. For those of you who are not familiar with the Microsoft Graph, it's a REST API that enables you to access the entire product palette of Azure and Office 365 and do things like read all users, read details about a single user, access your emails, send emails, access your calendar, access your Skype, your Teams meetings, and things like that. And this Microsoft Graph is just another API. So in my example, my client, Angular, gets the permission to access not just our custom API, but it also gets the permission to do, you see it here, a user read for the current user and a user read all for all users in the Azure Active Directory. So what I wanted to show here is Microsoft offered APIs are not special to custom APIs. They simply have stranger looking GUIDs here, but that's just because Microsoft published them. So if we go into the portal here, and if we go here in the client app, and we take a look at the API permissions, again, it will take a second until the permissions will be visible. Here it is. You see, now our client is allowed to access our custom API with both scopes and is allowed to access the Graph API with these two scopes. Interactively, it would even be simpler to add the permissions. You click on it, you see all the different APIs. You have the Microsoft API, like the Graph API and Key Vault and Power BI and all this stuff. Or you have your own APIs. These are the custom APIs. This is how you would do it interactively in the portal. But I told you, and I repeat myself consciously, infrastructure as code rules. This is why I did it in a script. And you can take a look at the script after the session. Good. Simon, what do you say? Should we try it in Angular? Of course. I think we should give it a go. Let's go into Angular. And here in Angular, I have prepared a small little app. And the most important thing here first is these two things. We are using the Microsoft Identity Platform, the newest version of the Microsoft Identity Platform. And the good news is that Microsoft has now support for not only generic browser clients, but special support for Angular. And if I can remember correctly, there is also a beta version for dedicated support in React applications. I'm not a React developer. I'm an Angular developer. So I feel more familiar with the Angular part. But the thing is, you do not have to implement that on your own. It's really, really simple to get Angular going. All you have to do is you have to specify here 3 GUIDs. The first one is the client ID. Let's go back in the portal. This is the client. So I specify here the client ID. This is the client ID. Then the Azure Active Directory tenant ID, I already copied that one. And finally, the URL of my custom API, it runs on a local dev server that you see here. That is all you have to do. Inside of Angular, it's really not complicated. This is not an Angular talk, so please excuse that I'm not going into details, but just to give you an idea. You register a bunch of so-called Microsoft Authentication Library modules, add a bunch of providers, and then you have an easy-to-use API with which you can, for instance, let me see here, trigger a login or trigger a logout or check whether the user is already signed in. So the point that I want to make here, without going into the details of the API, it's really not complicated if you use the existing APIs, and I definitely encourage you to do that.
Just as a small side note, if you're looking at documentation and articles on the web, be aware that there has been another library which was developed for that use case called ADL, and that's no longer supported. So just be careful when looking at samples and at articles that it might use some stuff that is being phased out within the next year.
Thank you for pointing that out. That is a very important thing here. Now, here I'm in my browser, and this is my Angular app. It's not very fancy, but the important thing that I would like to show you here is the networking stuff. So I need my phone here because I have multi-factor authentication, and I click on login. Now, what's going to happen here is, oh, I already was logged in. So let me quickly log out so I can really show you what's going on. So I was logged in because I, of course, tried everything before the session. So now I'm logged out, and I will click on login. And now comes the important part. You see, we are redirecting away from our client, and we now gave the control to Microsoft's Azure Active Directory. I can click on the account here, and I do multi-factor authentication. This is now the stuff where I give control to Azure Active Directory, and I have to present my fingerprint. I presented my fingerprint, and now we are going back, and now we are authenticated in Azure. And if you want to take a look here you see that we got this code. I was talking about this code before, and this code here that you see here is then exchanged for tokens. When I now call the Microsoft Graph API, I will do that here, get profile, you will see that I now get the consent screen. This is the consent screen that I told you about. And this is the client, or Azure Active Directory, making the user aware that our demo client is now going to access Azure Active Directory Graph API on our behalf as Rainer Stropek. I accept it, and then you can see it here. We get issued, where is it? Somewhere here. I think we should see it up. We will, here in the response. Yeah, here in the response. Now we got the tokens. So now I can click on get profile, and it works. And as you can see here, this is a call. This is a call to the Graph API. And in this Graph API, the token that my Angular application, which was specifically issued for the Graph API, was now injected by the Microsoft Identity Platform. In the code in our Angular application, we didn't have to do anything special. Let me see here. I just used the HTTP client. I just did a GET. I don't need to do anything. The Microsoft Identity Platform automatically recognizes the Graph API call, gets the token, does the consent, injects the token, and I can access my profile. Last but not least, I promised you that we access a protected API. And this will be my last demo, because then we are out of time, and yeah, we can do that. I think we have 2 or 3 minutes left. That sounds good. And this is the last demo. That is good, because now we want to access a custom API. Let me quickly copy the GUID of our custom API. This one, everything else was pre-filled. Now here I have a custom API written in ASP.NET Core, and this supports here a get all orders. And please note that up here we have authorize written on top of it. So we cannot access this REST API without authentication.
Did you use the same audience URI, or does it need to be updated as well?
I used the, that is the same. I already filled that out.
Okay, perfect.
So the important thing is just a single line of code in the startup method. Here we say add Microsoft Identity Web API authentication, and we give it the ID of the app API. We gave it the identifier URI of the API and the Azure Active Directory tenant, and we don't need to do anything more. With this line of code, our API is protected. And if we now go here into our app here in Angular, let's quickly clean that one. I click on orders. Here it is. Oh, I forgot one thing. No, it worked. I copied it. It's okay. You see a new consent screen because now my Angular app is doing more. It's not just accessing the Graph API. It's accessing my custom API. So I need to accept a new consent screen because it wants to read data and write data. Click on accept. And if everything works out nicely and I click on get orders, you see the breakpoint is hit. We could access the API, and if we take a look at the claims, I get all the different claims. As you can see, it's here. Oh, I cannot zoom in here. I hope you can still see it on the screen. I get all the different claims here from Azure Active Directory, and now I can do things like scope-based authorization. I can add policies to Azure, to ASP.NET Core APIs and things like that. And now my API is protected, and only my, here you see it, my Angular app, which was registered as a client app in Azure Active Directory, can access my API. And this is what I wanted to demo to you. This is what we wanted to show you. So let me turn on the cam. What are the next steps? I think we are already out of time, but this was our last demo, so it was good. If you have any questions, we will stick around, definitely, in Discord. So contact us in the Discord channel. We shared the slides. We shared the code, so you can take a look at it. The most important takeaways that we wanted to show you is we wanted to give you a closer, a deeper understanding. Let's maybe end up by going back to the slides here. A deeper understanding of some basic terminology. What is an authorization server with Azure Active Directory as its content? What are the new flows that you have to think of? How does it work to register a client app? How does it work to register an API app? And how difficult is it to embed the Microsoft provided client APIs in Angular and in ASP.NET Core? We hope we did a good job. Thank you very much. I just saw that Mara liked the demo. We enjoyed giving this demo very much. And yeah, have a great rest of this Global Azure Austrias. I see Simon has already started the banner at the bottom here. So take a look at the upcoming sessions, visit them, and enjoy the rest of the
There is also a detailed question concerning the storage of tokens, but I guess we'll take that to Discord afterwards.
Yeah, I have to apologize. I talked too much, so we couldn't take this one. Let's take it offline, go to Discord, and Miraldo, we will definitely answer your question there. So, goodbye.
Goodbye.